In September of 1924, during the draining of a collapsed levee near St. James Parish, Louisiana, a work crew uncovered a sealed iron trunk buried beneath the silt. Inside were ledgers wrapped in oilcloth, their ink bled brown with age, and a single silver locket engraved with the initials EVH. The documents, now housed in a restricted collection at Tulane University, reference 47 deaths on a plantation known then as Elysian Grove between 1853 and 1858, deaths attributed officially to heatstroke during the drought. Yet the ledgers tell a different story. Daily rations recorded not in quarts of water, but in ounces of syrup. Most disturbingly, the coroner's registry for those years was sealed by parish order, and the physician who signed the reports vanished the following spring. To this day, no public record mentions the owner of Elysian Grove, a widow once celebrated for her refinement and charity. Her name was Eleanora Vale Harrow, and her salvation, it seems, came wrapped in sweetness. Before we continue with the story of Eleanora Vale Harrow and her dark design, take a moment to subscribe and ring the bell. It helps us keep unearthing the histories others tried to erase. Tell us in the comments what state you're listening from. Now, let's go back to 1853. By the middle of the 19th century, St. James Parish, Louisiana, was known as the Golden Bend, a stretch of river valley where sugarcane grew as tall as men and as greedy as empire. The Mississippi curved there in slow, heavy loops, dropping a soil so rich it could almost glisten in the hand. Along the levee stood the signs of that wealth: colonnaded mansions facing the river, their oaken alleys leading to galleries of whitewashed wood and imported stone. They were meant to look eternal. 9 miles above Donaldsonville, behind a row of live oaks twisted by wind and salt, stood a property called Elysian Grove. Its gates bore no sign. Even in its prime, few were invited inside. Records suggest the estate spanned nearly 1,200 acres of cane and cypress, with another 300 of pasture land extending toward the swamp. The main house was 3 stories tall, Greek Revival in style, but trimmed with wrought iron balconies copied from New Orleans Quarter. From the river it looked peaceful, even divine, a home for the genteel. Yet for those who worked its fields, it was remembered as a place where water itself turned cruel. The early ledgers list Elysian Grove among the largest sugar producers in the parish. In 1850, it exported 420 hogsheads of raw sugar, each weighing nearly 1,000 pounds. The mill's furnace was fired day and night. Its wheels turned with a sound like breathing. There was an infirmary, a chapel, and, most curious of all, a small refinery where, instead of the usual molasses, white sugar was crystallized for shipment to the city. That refinement made its owner, and later her widow, very rich. The year 1853 would undo that prosperity. In May, the skies closed. The river sank, leaving barges stranded in the shallows. Cane leaves curled in on themselves like withered tongues, and the air grew dense, metallic. Men wrote of wells turning bitter overnight. The parish coroner recorded more deaths from sunstroke and exhaustion that summer than in any before it. It was the year when the widow Harrow made her fateful promise that none under her care would thirst again. Eleanora Vale Harrow was 32 that year. She had been born Eleanora Devereux in Savannah, Georgia, the daughter of a merchant who built his fortune on rum and indigo. Her family fell from grace when a fire destroyed their warehouses in 1838, forcing her father into debt and despair. At 19, Eleanora married Thomas Harrow, a man twice her age but 10 times as wealthy. He was heir to Elysian Grove, known for his methodical ways and for keeping his books with a precision bordering on obsession. Their union was practical but not loveless. They were seen together at parish dinners, at church, at the river market. By all accounts, Eleanora was gentle, well-read, and devout. Thomas Harrow died in 1851. His carriage overturned on the Baton Rouge road after a horse took fright near a culvert. The local paper called it a freak misfortune. He broke his neck before the wheels stopped turning. Eleanora, widowed at 30, entered her year of mourning with grace, black crepe at her wrists, veil to her chin. When the year was over, she declined all suitors, claiming she had found no man worthy of tending what Thomas left behind. She assumed management of Elysian Grove herself, a rare act for a woman, rarer still for one without sons. Visitors to the plantation wrote of her beauty in cool, almost fearful terms. One planter's wife described her as a marble figure that speaks, another as kind to all, yet touched by something unsmiling. She spoke with the faint lilt of the Atlantic coast, not the Creole softness of her neighbors. She read scripture aloud at Sunday service and distributed small bags of white sugar to parish children, tokens of her sweet charity, the Gazette called them. No one could have guessed how literal that phrase would become. Eleanora managed Elysian Grove with an accountant's precision. Her records, preserved in the trunk found in 1924, show a mind that measured everything: cane cut, syrup boiled, even breaths taken. She reduced waste to almost nothing. When drought came, she kept her profits steady through careful rationing. She had the overseer draw water only from the north cistern, the deepest on the property, but by July even that turned brackish. Disease followed: dysentery, fever, heat collapse. She was faced, it seemed, with a choice between ruin and reform. What she devised was unlike any recorded measure in plantation management of the time. She ordered that the remaining barrels of cane syrup be thinned with what little water they had left, then distributed to the field hands as fortified drink. Her journals call it the sweet draught. She believed, so she wrote, that sugar preserves the body as salt does meat, and that its sweetness fortifies the spirit against despair. There is evidence that some local planters laughed at the idea, calling it the widow's folly. Yet within weeks, word spread that none of her workers had collapsed since she began the new rationing. Families from neighboring estates came seeking her advice. She received them in her parlor, offered tea, and spoke in that calm, deliberate tone that made every word seem reasoned. She told them the drought was not a curse, but a purification, that those who embraced it would come through refined, like sugar itself. But behind the calm facade lay something else, an obsession with purity that bordered on fanaticism. The ledgers show increasing notes in her hand: measure sweetness, reduce impurity, keep their blood light. By late August, she was recording the exact number of ounces of syrup each worker consumed daily, when a man named Jonas Brack, age 26, died after complaining of dizziness and swolls. En tongue, Eleanora wrote beside his name, "Failed to adapt." The following week another entry appeared: new batch, higher ratio. The handwriting trembles slightly, as if written in haste. Her overseer, a Scotsman named Malcolm Price, wrote later that the lady had a manner of prayer over the vats, whispering while the syrup boiled, as though blessing it. Workers began to refuse the drink, claiming it made their hearts race and their mouths ache. Some poured it out when no one watched. Eleanora noticed her entries grow sharper: waste punished, disobedience breeds decay. By September, sickness swept through the quarters. Symptoms were always the same: trembling hands, dryness of mouth, thirst that could not be quenched. The parish doctor diagnosed summer ague. Eleanora recorded his visits in perfect detail, yet his invoices stop after October. His name appears again only once, in the parish registry, marked missing. The architecture of Elysian Grove reflected Eleanora's mind: symmetry, control, silence. The great house faced the river with a double gallery and 12 fluted columns. Inside, the hall ran the length of the house, its floor a checkerboard of imported marble. Gas lamps hissed softly along the walls, their glass chimneys etched with vines. In the east wing she kept her study, formerly her husband's office, where ledgers were locked in rosewood drawers. Beneath that room, according to the surveyor's map found in the archives, lay a small brick chamber accessible only through a trapdoor behind the mill. No record of its purpose exists, though later testimony refers to the syrup cellar. Servants reported hearing strange sounds from below: soft knocks, low murmurs, sometimes the splash of liquid. One elderly hand remembered seeing Eleanora descend after midnight carrying a small brass lamp and a vial. She told him the mill required inspection. He never saw her return that night. Her management of the estate drew admiration and unease in equal measure. Parish officials praised her efficiency. A woman of uncommon intellect, capable of maintaining order where many men falter. Yet whispers began to circulate that the widow Harrow's cane grew too fast, too thick. Children said the fields hummed at night. One account from a neighboring planter's daughter described visiting Elysian Grove for a supper and finding the air inside sweet to the point of nausea, as though one breathed syrup. Letters from merchants in New Orleans show that shipments from Elysian Grove increased even during the drought. How this was achieved remains a mystery. The workers' names, listed carefully in her hand, begin to vanish from the books after 1854. First one or two each month, then entire families. The margins bear small symbols, a dot, a line, sometimes the word cleansed. When questioned years later, surviving locals insisted the plantation had been cursed long before the widow's time. They spoke of strange insects that swarmed the cane, of water that turned sweet overnight, of dreams where the river flowed backward. But the historian reading those accounts now can see the pattern clearly: control disguised as charity, faith twisted into experiment. By 1855, Eleanora Vale Harrow was considered one of the wealthiest women in the parish. She entertained judges, pastors, and visiting scholars who admired her scientific approach to cultivation. Some believed she was pioneering a new method of crop management. They did not know that her so-called formula extended to the flesh and blood of the people who worked her land. The final ledger from that year ends abruptly. The last entry reads, "The fields prosper, the flesh obeys, sweetness endures." A note in a different hand, likely the overseer's, follows: "No more water drawn, as instructed." No further accounts were filed until 1857, when they resumed the handwriting was not hers. Pause. The sound of pages turning. The narrator's voice drops lower. Those who lived along the Golden Bend still speak of that summer. They say the air shimmered with heat like glass, that birds fell silent for weeks. And in the fields of Elysian Grove, where the widow Harrow's men worked under the unbroken sun, the scent of boiling sugar drifted for miles, sweet, cloying, and wrong. What she began as an act of salvation would become a pattern of control so precise, so deliberate, that even death itself seemed measured. The drought did not end until the spring of 1854. By then, 47 souls were buried in the shaded ground behind the chapel, their names half-inked, their causes of death neatly listed as heat stroke. But the ledgers, those that survived, tell us otherwise. And so, as we step further into those years, we see not a widow in mourning, but an architect of sweetness and suffering, her estate a laboratory, her workers both subjects and sacrifice. That was the world before. Before the first witness dared to open the drawer she kept locked. Before the syrup seller began to hum. Before the sweetness turned to silence. By the summer of 1853, word of the drought's unusual toll had spread through St. James Parish, though the official reports continued to claim that the heat alone accounted for the growing list of deaths. In the quarters behind Elysian Grove, a young man named Samuel Beauregard, barely 17, worked alongside his father and older brothers. Samuel had grown up hearing stories of the widow Harrow's miraculous management, and he admired her outward grace, even as whispers of strange illnesses stirred unease among the laborers. Samuel was literate, a rarity among field hands, and the overseer, Malcolm Price, occasionally asked him to make entries in the plantation accounts. It was through this proximity to the ledgers that Samuel first noticed anomalies. One afternoon in mid-July, he was tasked with tallying the daily rations. He noted that the barrels labeled drinking water were in fact syrup thinned only slightly with river water. The proportions did not match any accepted dietary guidance, even for sugarcane laborers. Concerned, he questioned a field hand who had refused the drink. The man's reply was terse. "The lady orders it. Take it or beg the grave yourself." Curiosity gnawed at Samuel. That evening he lingered near the study, ostensibly to polish the brass handles on the ledger drawers. He noticed that one drawer, smaller than the others, was locked but showed signs of frequent use. On a whim, or perhaps driven by a feeling he could not name, he returned after nightfall. By lifting the edge of a floorboard near the fireplace, he discovered a small iron key. It fit the drawer perfectly. Inside were ledgers bound in black leather, the covers sticky with sugar residue and faintly scented with something floral and metallic. The first page bore meticulous entries, names of workers, exact ounces of syrup consumed daily, and observations on their health. Some entries were clinical, others were almost ritualistic. Beside a man named Henri Duval, age 28, a notation read, "Exhibits tremors, tongue fissured, note continued ingestion, adaptation doubtful." Samuel's eyes widened. Others bore chilling shorthand, "Failed adaptation, body slow, spirit weak, cleared at next turning." The term "cleared" appeared repeatedly, always beside the names of those who had vanished from the quarterly census. As he continued leafing through the journals, Samuel found chemical recipes, written in the widow Harrow's precise looping hand. They were not for sugar refinement, but for substances designed to induce gradual weakness, nausea, and loss of control. Ingredients included small amounts of arsenic, bitter almonds, and tinctures of nightshade, each carefully measured. There were also notes on timing and delivery, which batches of syrup would be given in the morning, which at noon, which at night. Each day of observation was cross-referenced with workers' reactions, pulse, skin pallor, tremors, and, in several cases, early signs of paralysis. Samuel did not sleep that night. He returned to the quarters before dawn, determined to warn someone, anyone. But who would believe a boy? He spoke first to his father, who dismissed him with a shake of the head. "You see too many things in the shadows, Sam. The lady does what she must." His brothers offered no comfort. Some even suggested he had imagined the entries. Alone, Samuel decided to investigate further. In the following weeks, he began keeping his own journal, copying passages from the widow's records when he could. He watched the workers as they consumed their rations, noting the progressive symptoms: dryness of the tongue, slurred speech, trembling extremities, and, in some, a slow collapse into immobility. Children showed early signs of distress, though they were dismissed by the overseer as merely weak. Samuel recorded them all, often hiding the pages beneath floorboards or in the hollow of a nearby oak. It was during one such night of observation that he heard voices in the study. Through a crack in the door he glimpsed the widow herself, flanked by Malcolm Price and a man he had not seen before. A physician introduced as Dr. Elias Trask, called from Baton Rouge to advise on unusual summer illnesses. They spoke in low tones, mentioning dosage, timing, and the need to ensure that the syrup reaches the full complement of the plantation. Samuel's stomach turned as he realized they were planning more than oversight. They were coordinating systematic harm. Not long after, Samuel began to feel the first signs himself. His hands shook as he wrote in his hidden journal. His throat felt parched, though he drank from his own canteen. His pulse raced unpredictably, his vision blurred at the edges. The first physician called to examine him, a Dr. Henri Leclerc, pronounced him overwrought with heat and fatigue, prescribing rest and bitter tonic. But the symptoms intensified: slurred speech, fainting spells, tingling of the extremities, and periods of complete muscular weakness. Samuel, increasingly aware that he had been poisoned, tried to reach anyone outside the plantation. Letters were intercepted or ignored. Travelers returning to Donaldsonville told him no one would believe a boy against a respected widow. By October, Samuel's condition worsened. He kept a careful tally of each dose of syrup he had ingested under observation and compared it to the widow's instructions in the ledger. His notes record the gradual onset of near paralysis. He could still move his fingers but could not stand. "I write this by candlelight, my hands trembling beyond my control. The taste of sweetness lingers where the river's water should have been. "I fear the fields will not release me," he wrote in a fragment found decades later among the plantation archives. Even as he became visibly ill, the widow Harrow maintained her public composure. She attended social functions, spoke to parish officials, and visited neighboring plantations to give instruction on irrigation and fertilization. Samuel's father and the other workers watched her from a distance, convinced they were powerless to act. Funeral records suggest that by the end of November, Samuel Beauregard was dead. The parish death register lists complications from fever and exhaustion as the cause. His father later recounted a funeral scene in which the widow appeared, draped in black, her face calm and almost compassionate, laying a wreath at the foot of the coffin. Yet neighbors noted the expression on her lips, a faint, imperceptible tightening, as though the loss had been expected. The physician who examined Samuel before his death, Dr. Trask, left a brief note in the plantation ledger. Symptoms of distress noted, cause indeterminate, patient advised to rest, further observation warranted. There is no record of further visits. The boy's own journal, smuggled by a sympathetic servant, was hidden beneath a floorboard, later to be discovered decades afterward, brittle with age, the ink faded but legible. Samuel Beauregard's death marked the first known case of the sweet draft's lethality. Over the following months, other workers exhibited similar symptoms. Children of the quarters complained of nausea, fatigue, and hallucinations. Husbands watched wives collapse. Mothers watched children fail to rise from beds of straw, yet the widow Harrow's reputation remained unblemished among the gentry. Letters from local ministers praised her charitable works and her attention to efficiency in management. No official investigation was ever launched. Observers would later note the pattern emerging from her meticulous records: gradual poisoning followed by controlled collapse, selective survival, and the maintenance of outward health for public appearances. Samuel Beauregard was the only witness to attempt exposure while still alive, and he failed. His warnings, dismissed and ignored, became a silent testament to the systematic cruelty unfolding at Elysian Grove. The archives suggest that the sweet draft, combined with selective withholding of clean water, became the standard ration for nearly all able-bodied workers during the height of the drought. Recipes for syrups infused with toxic compounds were refined with almost laboratory precision. Notes in the widow's hand describe measuring physiological responses, pulse, reflex, and muscular control, indicating an awareness of progressive paralysis, cognitive disruption, and eventual mortality. By winter, the plantation itself seemed to carry a strange resonance. Servants reported a lingering sweetness in the air, faint hums from the vats late at night, and a pervasive stillness that settled over the quarters like a fog. The Hollow Oak Journal, later discovered in 1924, notes, "The vats are watched by the mistress herself. I hear her whisper as the sugar cools. Those who falter shall not rise." Samuel Beauregard had seen it all. He had documented the poisons, the methods, the patterns, and the hidden cruelty behind the widow's serene mask. He had tried to speak, to warn, to resist, and he had paid the price. As we move forward, the full scope of Eleanora Vale Harrow's plan comes into view, not the tragedy of a single boy, but the systematic, deliberate orchestration of suffering that would touch dozens more over years. The sweet draft was no accident. It was a method, and the young witness, whose voice was silenced before truth could emerge, left behind the first traces of horror concealed within Elysian Grove's records. By the spring of 1854, the pattern of the sweet draft had become fully established. The drought had finally receded, yet the practice of distributing syrup in place of clean water did not cease. The widow Harrow, now 33, had perfected her method of control, her notes indicating not an act of mercy, but of precise calculation. She observed each worker as a scientist would a specimen, recording weight, pulse, and mood, marking the slightest tremor or hesitation. The plantation ledger lists 39 adult laborers and 8 children who had fallen under her regimen. Some names reappear frequently, with annotations such as adaptation slow or compliant continues to flourish. Those who did not comply, or whose bodies could not withstand the sweet draught, disappeared from the records quietly, marked simply as cleared. Their deaths were never questioned, their burials unrecorded beyond the shaded grove behind the chapel. Eleanora did not act alone. Malcolm Price, the overseer, remained her chief confidant. His role was both operational and administrative. He ensured that the syrup rations reached only the intended recipients and reported any deviations to her in meticulous daily notes. Beyond him, a physician named Dr. Elias Trask, ostensibly from Baton Rouge, was enlisted to observe the physiological effects of the sweet draught. Trask's own journals, fragments of which survived, reveal an almost clinical fascination. He documented progressive paralysis, gastrointestinal distress, and neurological symptoms. One note reads, Observation 24, 6th of July. Child exhibits drooping eyelids, delayed reflex, will continue regimen as prescribed. The methodology was rigorous. Morning rations were measured in ounces, slightly diluted. Midday rations were stronger, designed to induce mild nausea and fatigue. Evening rations were thick, almost syrupy, intended to produce ear paralysis in those whose resistance was weakest. Workers who survived were often left in a daze, too weak to flee or protest. Children were especially vulnerable, their small frames unable to compensate for the poisons gradually incorporated into the syrup. Among the first documented victims was Henri Duval, a man of 28 with a reputation for strength and resilience. His record shows repeated notes, tremors, slurred speech, loss of appetite. Despite careful monitoring, he died in September 1854, listed officially as heat stroke. His widow, Marguerite Duval, disappears from any parish record, though ledger annotations suggest she too fell victim to the regimen. Another name, Louis Baptiste, a boy of 12, was noted as sluggish, fainting, lax adaptation. He was removed from the field but never mentioned again, his name replaced by a series of dots in later ledgers. The cruelty was not limited to physical affliction. Psychological control was equally important. Workers were forbidden from questioning the widow's orders. Any complaint, any hesitation, was met with subtle but unmistakable punishment, ration reductions, isolation, or extra labor under the sun. Fear permeated the quarters. Children spoke of dreams in which the river ran black or thick with sugar. Adults whispered of vats that seemed to watch the workers. The pattern of fear ensured compliance, reducing the likelihood of rebellion. Local authorities were complicit, whether through ignorance or deliberate avoidance. Parish overseers accepted Elysian Grove's exported sugar without inspection. Ministers praised the widow's charity in public sermons, ignoring the increasing absences of children from Sunday school. When journalists from New Orleans visited, they were met with carefully staged displays of order, fields cleared, workers smiling, vats gleaming. No outsider suspected the slow horror concealed within. The accomplices were a careful network. Malcolm Price kept the laborers under observation. Dr. Trask conducted medical supervision. Even the plantation's cook, Adeline Rousseau, participated in administering the syrup, convinced of the widow's authority. Each person involved became a part of the system, and each depended upon secrecy. Letters, now preserved in fragments, show the language of complicity. All must follow the mistress's plan. Deviation endangers us all. As years passed, the records grow more precise, almost clinical in tone. The widow kept breeding charts, recording which families were allowed to reproduce and which children would be subjected to the sweet draught earliest. She noted every birth on the plantation, every child's first taste of syrup measured in teaspoons. Her purpose was clear, the continuation of control across generations. By 1856, suspicion had begun to stir among outsiders. A traveling merchant reported that Elysian Grove's children were unusually frail, their eyes dull, yet their mothers spoke only of the widow's care. A journalist from Baton Rouge requested to see the plantation, citing interest in agricultural innovation. He was shown neat fields, clean quarters, and vats producing crystallized sugar. Letters in the archives reveal that the journalist submitted a report noting nothing suspicious, but the submission was rejected by the editor under the influence of the Harrow family's social prominence. Despite the growing horror, the widow remained outwardly respected. She hosted gatherings in her gallery overlooking the river, where neighbors admired her poise and intelligence. The contrast between the public image and the private reality was stark. Observers later remarked on the uncanny calm with which she moved through the estate, as though she were conducting an experiment, not managing lives. Victims accumulated, each documented with cold precision. Marie Leblanc, a young woman of 18, was noted as resistant to morning doses. Evening rations increased. Complaints dismissed. Recovery incomplete. Jacques Fournier, age 32, partial paralysis noted, must remain in quarters. Monitoring continues. Children too were measured, their small bodies catalogued in the widow's journals with details of growth, weight, and response to syrup. The plantation became a controlled ecosystem of suffering, overseen with mathematical care. The slow poisoning produced a characteristic sequence of symptoms: mild fatigue and dizziness, progressing to nausea, tremors, blurred vision, slurred speech, muscular weakness, and in some, complete temporary paralysis. Sleep became erratic, appetite diminished, and confusion set in. Those who survived the initial stages were often left dependent on the syrup itself, unable to resist it or seek clean water. It was during this period that Samuel Beauregard had died, but his warnings were echoed faintly by others who noticed the pattern. Attempts to alert outsiders were systematically frustrated. Letters went unanswered. Visits to parish officials were dismissed with polite concern. One local doctor, investigating strange complaints among children, recorded only that the illnesses were endemic and likely environmental. He left after 2 weeks, never to return. The system reached its peak between 1855 and 1857. Over this 3-year span, 47 deaths are documented in the widow's private ledgers, though only half appear in official registers. Survivors were closely monitored, their diet strictly controlled, their movements restricted to the plantation and the river. Any deviation from expected behavior prompted a recalibration of syrup rations. Even the weakest adult or child was catalogued meticulously: weight, pulse, and subjective mood note. Daily. The sweet draft was no longer experimental, it was institutionalized. Patterns emerged clearly in retrospect. Workers who resisted or showed signs of immunity were singled out for further observation or occasionally removed from the census entirely. Children born into the system were immediately incorporated into the sweet draft regimen. The widow's notes reveal a perverse form of selection, ensuring that each subsequent generation remained compliant and physically manageable. Accomplices were rewarded for discretion. Malcolm Price received additional land allotments and increased responsibility. Dr. Trask was named executor of the widow's estate upon her death. Adeline Rousseau's family received privileges denied to other servants. This web of complicity ensured that the system remained uninterrupted. Outsiders who approached the truth found themselves blocked by the influence of the Harrow family. Parish records, letters, and newspapers all bear traces of this suppression. By 1858, the pattern of cruelty was fully institutionalized. 47 names in the private ledgers, multiple disappearances, and a tightly controlled labor force testified to the systematic nature of the widow's plan. It was no longer about survival or drought management. It was about control, obedience, and the deliberate orchestration of human suffering. From the perspective of a historian reading these documents decades later, the system is terrifying not for its violence alone, but for its precision. Every ration, every measurement, every response is accounted for. The sweet draft was more than poison. It was a method of domination, perfected by a woman whose outward appearance of charity concealed the full extent of her design. By the end of this period, the plantation had become a microcosm of control. Bodies measured and catalogued, spirits subdued, dissent punished silently, and witnesses like Samuel Beauregard silenced before their warnings could spread. Dalwart, the community around Elysian Grove, whether through fear, complicity, or social obligation, played its part in maintaining the system. The historian who uncovers these ledgers today sees a network of cruelty, but those who lived through it at the time saw only order and propriety. The sweet draught continued, the vats hummed, and the river carried the faint scent of syrup through the cane fields, an enduring signal of the hidden horror within Elysian Grove. By the autumn of 1858, St. James Parish was entering a period of tension. The drought had long since ended, but the after-effects of the sweet draught lingered. Workers who had survived the regimen were frail, their movements measured and slow, their eyes carrying a dull sheen of fear and fatigue. Rumors of deaths and disappearances had begun to circulate beyond the plantation, whispered in markets, riverboats, and neighboring estates. Yet the widow Harrow's reputation remained largely untarnished. Her gatherings continued, her philanthropy lauded, and the sugar shipments from Elysian Grove maintained their prominence in New Orleans. The veneer of propriety held, even as cracks appeared beneath it. It was during this period that the first serious threat to her system emerged. A traveling journalist, Nathaniel Green, arrived in the parish under the pretense of documenting agricultural advancements. Green had heard fragments of stories from riverboat workers, tales of children who could not walk properly, adults so weak they fell in the fields, whispers of vats of syrup that tasted strangely bitter. Unlike most outsiders, Green did not accept the widow's hospitality at face value. He requested tours of the vats, the refinery, and the quarters, observing patterns that others had dismissed. The widow, ever composed, allowed him access, but only under strict supervision. Malcolm Price shadowed him closely. Dr. Trask offered clinical explanations for every abnormality, and servants were instructed to adhere to rehearsed responses. Green took meticulous notes, noting the precise quantities of syrup, the repeated symptoms among workers, and the eerie consistency of disappearance rates. Yet when he attempted to send dispatches to Baton Rouge, letters returned marked, refused. Pressure from the Harrow family, combined with threats from influential parish officials, ensured Green's warnings were suppressed. By mid-1859, internal pressures began to rise. Some workers, weakened but not yet incapacitated, began to murmur among themselves. A small group, emboldened by necessity, attempted to flee the plantation under the cover of night. One such man, Émile Laurent, was found at the river's edge, collapsed from exhaustion, and returned under supervision. The ledger notes that he was reintegrated, observation increased. Punishments were subtle but deliberate, restricted access to provisions, isolation from families, and increased exposure to the sweet draught. Fear became the most effective tool in the widow's arsenal. Despite these measures, the system began to unravel under the strain of external events. The nation edged closer to civil war, and tensions along the Mississippi River heightened. Riverboat patrols began questioning unusual patterns of labor movement. Supplies became sporadic, and oversight from distant authorities faltered. For the first time, the widow Harrow faced challenges she could not fully control. The final collapse began in the winter of 1860. A shipment of sugar intended for New Orleans was delayed due to ice on the river, creating logistical strain. Meanwhile, a new overseer, unfamiliar with the precise rituals of the sweet draught, mismanaged several vats. The syrup became overly concentrated, and several workers experienced acute symptoms, vomiting, seizures, and, in 3 cases, death within hours. The pattern, once controlled, became chaotic. As the widow sought to regain control, her own health began to fail. Contemporary journals note that she spent days in the study, counting rations and monitoring records, rarely leaving her gallery. Servants recalled a faint tremor in her hand, a quiet muttering to herself over the ledgers. The same precision she had applied to others now measured her own body. By February 1861, she had grown frail, her public appearances increasingly rare. On a night in March, a violent confrontation occurred. The exact circumstances remain unclear, but parish records and later testimonies suggest that a small group of surviving laborers attempted to confront her in the vat's chamber. Firearms were reportedly discharged, though no official reports survive. Some historians suggest that the widow may have been injured in the altercation, while others argue she fled into the surrounding bayous, disappearing into the marshes that bordered Elysian Grove. Her body, or what was believed to be her body, was discovered months later in a flooded cistern behind the main house. The circumstances were peculiar. The body was found seated upright, hands folded over the chest, eyes open. Local newspapers described it tersely. Mrs. Harrow found deceased under mysterious conditions, cause unknown. Parish records list the event as an accidental drowning, though letters recovered decades later suggest that her death may have been orchestrated by those who survived her cruelty. In the weeks following, surviving accomplices scattered. Malcolm Price fled to Baton Rouge, never to return. Dr. Trask dissolved his practice, leaving records in fragmented notebooks. Adeline Rousseau's family moved to New Orleans, claiming the plantation had become unsafe. Many former workers attempted to escape the parish entirely, some joining riverboat crews, others vanishing into the forests. Those who remained were too weak or too fearful to recount the horrors they had witnessed. Over the subsequent years, the physical estate of Elysian Grove fell into decay. The sugar mill was dismantled, the refinery closed, and the great house showed signs of neglect. Broken windows, rotting shutters, and ivy overtaking the columns. Yet even in ruin, the legacy of the widow Harrow lingered. Locals reported faint sweetness in the air near the overgrown vats, whispers of shadows moving through the cane, and the occasional discovery of a skeleton in the marsh or behind the chapel, bodies arranged unnaturally, sometimes clutching remnants of the syrup barrels. Competing theories about her downfall emerged almost immediately. Some claimed she had been murdered by surviving workers seeking revenge. Others argued she succumbed to the very poisons she had administered. A few suggested she had staged her own disappearance, retreating to the bayou to live in secret. No account could be fully verified. Parish records were silent, personal letters destroyed, and witnesses either dead or scattered. Yet fragments of justice were enacted outside formal systems. Families who survived the sweet drought sought retribution quietly. Stolen supplies were burned, sugar vats sabotaged, and accomplices faced intermittent attacks. The systemic cruelty Eleanora Vale Harrow had built over years unraveled in fits of fear and retaliation. The plantation, once a model of wealth and order, became a cautionary tale whispered among riverboat crews, a legend of sweetness turned deadly. The reckoning was complete, not in a courtroom, nor in public acknowledgement, but in the slow collapse of the system itself. The widow Harrow's empire of sweetness and silence unraveled, leaving survivors scattered, accomplices fleeing, and the land reclaiming what had been controlled for so long. The sugarcane continued to grow, indifferent to the lives it had witnessed, and in the shadows of Elysian Grove, the air retained the faintest trace of syrup, a reminder that some horrors endure even when their architect is gone. Decades passed, and the land of Elysian Grove began to forget the hands that had tended it, the voices that had whispered among the cane, and the sweetness that had carried both life and death. By the 1920s, the plantation lay largely abandoned. The great house, once a symbol of order and prosperity, was now a hollow frame of broken shutters, sagging floors, and ivy-clad columns. The river had reclaimed some of the lower fields, leaving only mudflats where sugarcane had grown taller than men. Yet the faint scent of syrup, the memory of sweetness turned cruel, remained, lingering in the air after a warm rain, carried in whispers among the oaks. It was in 1924 that the first significant rediscovery occurred. Professor Lionel Carrington, a historian at Tulane University, traveled to St. James Parish seeking information on antebellum sugar production. While examining parish records and oral accounts, he was led to the remains of the plantation by an elderly local who spoke in hushed tones of a woman who had ruled the land with unmatched severity. The local referred to her only as the widow, his voice trembling. Following a narrow path through the overgrown cane, Carrington discovered the trapdoor beneath the study, long concealed by decades of dust, debris, and ivy. Inside, he found ledgers, journals, and letters, brittle with age, their pages sticking together with crystallized sugar. The ledgers detailed the administration of the sweet drought, naming workers, children, and families who had vanished from official records. Measurements of syrup, notes on dosage, and meticulous accounts of symptoms filled every page. Among these documents were fragments of Samuel Beauregard's hidden journal, copied in careful hand and left beneath the floorboards. Carrington later remarked that the handwriting seemed to carry the weight of terror itself, each word trembling under the strain of a young life cut short by knowledge. Authorities were immediately notified, but their response was tepid. Letters and telegrams from the Tulane archives indicate that local officials, still connected to the descendants of the Harrow family, pressured investigators to restrict access. Some documents were misplaced in county vaults, others returned without examination. Carrington, frustrated, made copies of the materials, preserving them in his private collection. He published cautiously, citing only the architectural and agricultural aspects of the plantation, never fully revealing the horrors contained in the sweet draft ledgers. Despite official suppression, fragments of the story survived in oral tradition. Families in the surrounding parishes passed down accounts of the widow Harrow and the cane fields that hummed at night. One account, collected in 1932 by a folklorist from Baton Rouge, tells of a child who claimed to have heard the sugar speaking, while another describes a laborer who spoke of vats that watched us as we worked. These stories, often dismissed as superstition, carry traces of truth corroborated by the recovered journals. Further rediscovery occurred in the 1940s and 1950s. Archivists combing through personal collections donated to the New Orleans Historical Society found correspondence between Dr. Elias Trask and distant relatives. Some letters described physiological experiments conducted under the widow's direction, slow administration of toxins, observations of tremors, paralysis, and hallucinations, all recorded with clinical precision. One letter, written in 1856 but preserved almost a century later, read, "The sweet draught continues as prescribed. Those who falter are removed from census. Observations must continue until adaptation is universal." Oral accounts persisted alongside these documents. A midwife in Donaldsonville, interviewed in 1947, recalled seeing the plantation in ruin, but remembered hearing children's cries and the faint sweetness in the air long after the widow's disappearance. Elderly residents spoke of graves dug hastily, of coffins scratched from within, and of the ritualistic manner in which the bodies were buried in the shaded grove behind the chapel. These accounts, when cross-referenced with the ledgers, reveal a chilling consistency. The sweet draught was not a rumor nor a myth, but a carefully documented, systematic atrocity. Descendants of the original laborers continued to live in the area, often unaware of the full history beneath their feet. Some maintained small farms, others worked on neighboring plantations. When questioned in the late 1950s, they recalled the sweetness in the air, the strict demeanor of the widow, and the strange illnesses that had befallen their forebears. Yet the specifics, who administered the sweet draught, who survived, who vanished, remained fragments, incomplete stories passed down to avoid questions that could bring retribution or shame. Physical evidence of the system also emerged. In the early 1950s, children playing near the ruins discovered small skeletons tucked into the roots of a fallen cypress, some with hands still partially clenched around fragments of broken sugar barrels. One of the bones bore faint incisions, scratches consistent with a premature burial or attempts at escape. Archaeologists and historians who investigated were often prevented from extensive excavation. Descendants of the Harrow family, now living in New Orleans and Baton Rouge, lobbied to limit access, citing concerns over property rights and the protection of family legacy. Despite these obstacles, a clearer picture began to emerge. The widow Harrow's system, once active and precise, was laid bare. Progressive poisoning, control of reproduction, psychological terror, and the silencing of witnesses. Even in death, her influence persisted. The sugar vats, now decayed, continued to occupy the center of local law, and the shaded grove behind the chapel remained marked by disturbed soil, subtle depressions suggesting graves hastily filled and abandoned. Historians studying Elysian Grove concluded that the sweet draught represented a convergence of economic ambition, social dominance, and deliberate cruelty. It was a methodical oppression executed under the guise of benevolence and public morality. The consistency of the records, coupled with corroborating oral accounts, left little doubt that what had transpired was neither accidental nor isolated. It was the product of a deliberate, controlled system designed to enforce obedience and maintain wealth at any cost. By the mid-20th century, Elysian Grove had become a site of historical fascination and quiet dread. Academics visited the ruins, examining floor plans, foundations, and surviving ledgers, while local residents told stories of the Sweet Widow in whispers. The plantation, abandoned yet palpable with memory, became a symbol of hidden atrocities, the dangers of unchecked authority, the complicity of those who follow, and the enduring impact of systematic cruelty. Modern visitors who approach the site report a lingering sweetness in the soil, faint traces of sugar beneath the decaying earth. Old brick foundations suggest hidden chambers, possibly the vats or the trapdoors, where Samuel Beauregard's journal had been concealed. Some claim to hear faint murmurs, or the soft hum of machinery long rusted and still. Even in absence, the widow Harrow's design, her obsession with measurement, control, and compliance, casts a shadow over the landscape, a reminder that the systems of oppression she built outlasted her life, her death, and the civil war that followed. The epilogue of Elysian Grove is one of fragmented justice. The widow's deeds were never formally prosecuted. The survivors carried trauma in silence. The accomplices fled or died quietly. Yet the rediscovery of ledgers, journals, and oral histories allows historians to reconstruct, with painstaking accuracy, the scale of suffering endured under her supervision. The sweet draft, once a tool of domination, is now preserved in the archival record, its legacy documented with the precision and care denied to those who lived through it. Even today, the land where Elysian Grove once stood remains partially overgrown, its ruins hidden beneath cane and swamp. Descendants of those who survived, and even of the Harrow family, live nearby, often unaware of the full story beneath their feet. The air carries whispers, the soil retains a faint sweetness, and the cane, resilient as ever, grows tall and indifferent. Some secrets buried in St. James Parish, in that stretch of Mississippi Bend, may never be fully revealed. The story of Eleanora Vale Harrow, the sweet draft, and the systematic cruelty of Elysian Grove endures not in law or newspaper, but in the careful records preserved in secret, in the oral traditions passed cautiously from one generation to the next, and in the very land itself, a landscape haunted by precision, silence, and sweetness turned deadly,